Good morning. My name is Gary Matsuoka, and we're here at Laguna Hills Nursery in Santa Ana on a Saturday morning. And today's topic is the one we do the most on what is perfect soil and how we made our top pot potting soil, which is our bread and butter, and why we made it. So, the big problem we have in our industry is that right now, the potting soils that are being sold are generally not soil at all, or very little soil material that looks like soil in them. They're pretty much compost. So this particular product is probably more than 80% organic. And now if you go to a farm, now I'm not blaming the potting soil companies because they're just following the lead of our colleges telling the growers what to grow plants in. And that's another problem, is that pretty much all plants are grown in compost instead of dirt. Now, if you are a farmer, this is your perfect soil. So, perfect soil is quite sandy. So this is from a friend's farm in Irvine. When he plows his field, I'll step on it. It's like walking on a beach. This is like 85% sand. He says this is the best farmland he's ever had, and most farmers would dream of having soil this nice. So sand is basically really good dirt to grow plants in. It doesn't have much nutrition at all, or any nutrition. There's hardly any nutrition here, but that's not the role of soil. So that's the problem. So right now, most potting soil companies think that the role of soil is to provide nutrition. So they make it very nutritious, but as far as growing roots, not so good. So what do plants need from the dirt? We'll talk about plant roots. So if the plant is growing, not the bulb or seed, but actually green and growing, say like this grass here, what are they requiring from the soil? Number one and most important is intuitive, moisture or water. So the soil's got to be able to store moisture in order for that plant to live. In fact, generally roots on plants require moisture at all times. I mean, they really need the soil because the roots on plants aren't. Most of the plant is covered in wax, so that the water just doesn't evaporate. You know, if this wasn't covered in wax, it'd be dry in about a minute. It's so thin. The roots are not covered with any wax or anything that prevents water evaporation because they're absorbing water. So the soil around them's got to have moisture storage. That's most important. Two is gas exchange. This is not talked about at all, it seems. So roots on plants actually breathe oxygen just like we do. And they give off carbon dioxide just like we do. The green parts of the plant create oxygen from photosynthesis. They're taking carbon dioxide and use water to make sugar, and byproduct of that is oxygen. But the oxygen's got to go out into the atmosphere through the soil, through the surface of the soil, and then the roots can pick it up. So the soil's got to have good gas exchange, or at least some oxygen. So the roots do require oxygen. Three, insulation. So roots do not like to go below freezing. They don't like to go above 90 degrees. So this one role of the soil is to keep them insulated. So like, you know, if they got 120, 110 degrees like we've had some past years, that just burns the roots up. So it needs to insulate. I mean, minor support. So if the soil doesn't support the plant just falls over. So that's important. But for the majority of plants, nutrition's not a part of this. It's not what plants need from the ground.
On the gas exchange oxygen, how, I mean, obviously you get oxygen from soil. I
Mhm.
assume that's just through the water, right? Or anything else in
True,
there?
our tap water has enough oxygen for roots to live. Um, yeah, and if the water sits there too long, so if you have a area of your yard that's just a bog, and the water's not moving, and it just stays soaked for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, in theory, the roots of the plants can use up all the oxygen in the water that's not moving, and then start suffocating after being real wet for week after week after week. Generally, it doesn't happen. Plants are okay in near ponds, but it can happen. There are situations where the soil is so dense, the gas exchange, even though the water had enough oxygen to begin with, like it was raining or something, if the water doesn't move and the plants are using oxygen, they use oxygen a lot slower than we do. I mean, they say plants can hold their breath for 2 days minimum, whereas we got like what 4 minutes. So plants don't need as much oxygen. Plant roots don't need as much oxygen as we do, but they still need it.
So I harvest
Mm-hmm.
rainwater a lot. So I'll be using rainwater this fall. Be concerned for that water saving space using as oxygen.
Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'll continue to use that then.
Well, you can use it as long as you aerate it as you water. So if you have a pump and you have a hose nozzle where you can sprinkle it, so that aerates it, just to break it up into fine particles before it hits the ground. Because if water heats up, the warmer water is, you get much above 85 degrees, you're losing a lot of oxygen. The oxygen level starts dropping. The more, when you boil water, the oxygen it just comes out. So cold water holds a lot of oxygen, like rainwater around here, lots of oxygen. Uh, Hot water doesn't have any oxygen, so you have to be somewhere in between. But yeah, we've noticed that I have a trash can full of water in the middle of winter and it's an 80-degree day. That water is warmer than my hand. It's got to be in the 90s to be warmer than your hand. So the sun can certainly warm water up real hot. So then, I mean, hydroponics, they know that. They have to watch the temperature of the water in a hydroponics place, because if the oxygen level drops too low, all their plants floating in water die. So that so the water district knows this too. I mean, sometimes you turn on the water and you'll notice it's real milky looking. Well, that's not debris in there. Those are air bubbles. They aerate it right before they send it through the pipes to get the oxygen level back up again. Um, so the rules for the water district, 5 to 7 parts per million oxygen in the water. And plants have trouble when you get close to 2 parts per million. They start suffocating, and low oxygen levels promote root rot on plants. I'm sure rainwater, when we get it here, is probably 20, 25 parts. It's really airy, so it's important. Now, the way plants get their nutrients, this says we've talked about this at other classes, but the way plants get nutrients is not through this. For the majority of plants, I mean, there are a few plants that are exceptions, but for the majority of plants, you got your plant above ground, the roots in the dirt. Now, roots have to breathe oxygen, so they don't grow very deep. In forests, under great conditions, 1.5 feet. In a city, under great conditions, about 1 foot. If you have clay soil, the air can only go down maybe 8 or 10 inches. So 1.5 feet in the city. I've dug out trees, trunks this big in my yard, and they had roots this big, but they weren't any deeper than 8 inches. Uh, they weren't above the surface, they were below the surface, but because they have to breathe air, they don't go down very far. Now, the way that plants get nutrition, so back in the 80s, I believe, University of California, Davis, researchers went around the Central Valley determining how the soil affects plant life. And they said it doesn't. No matter what soil they're surveying, some soils had some specific nutrients, mineral nutrients, some didn't. They said no. The soil, no matter what type of soil it was, sand, clay, gravel, the same plants lived over in the entire Central Valley because they were recycling dead leaves. So in nature, there's all this dead leaf on the surface. And it's called duff. Primarily dead leaves. Of course, there's animal manure, some branches fall on the ground. And on average, it's 5 inches deep. And that's where all the minerals are that these plants need. Now, plants don't eat duff, and they can't live in it. The duff is the home of fungi, bacteria, amoebas, protozoa. I mean, there's all kinds of critters that live on dead leaves, pill bugs, worms. That's their habitat. And if you look in the duff layer, you'll see a lot of that going on. This is trying to consume plant material. The stems and trunks of plants are resistant to them. They're meant to be. But it's hard for plants' roots to live in here because it's trying to consume the plants. So the way most plants get their nutrition is that they have a fungus partner called a mycorrhizal fungi, and they're attached to the roots, and they go up into the duff layer, consume the dead leaves, and bring the nutrients back to the roots. Bacteria does that somewhat, but they said most of the nutrients in especially in a, what do you call it, a climax ecosystem like a forest, most of it's been done by mycorrhizal fungi. So they recycle the nutrients from the dead leaves back to the tree, and they said that can be as quick as 90 days. When the leaf falls off the tree, that fungus is attacking it. The nutrients from that leaf get back into the same tree within 90 days. They've checked that with radioactive carbon. So that's the normal system for most of the plants we grow. There are some plants that can mine the soil, and most of those are weeds. Their roots are highly evolved. They can just they can mine the soil and get enough nutrients to make some weeds, and then once they have dead leaves, then the mycorrhizal fungi and the more permanent plants, trees and shrubs, other perennials that operate with the mycorrhizal fungi come and take over. The weeds disappear because they no longer have any nutrition left in the soil. So, they say if you go to a climax ecosystem like a forest, like the Amazon rain jungle, and you analyze the soil, there are no nutrients in it because they're all here. They're in the dead stuff. They're either in the plants they're growing or they're in the dead stuff on the ground. The soil is totally depleted.
So if you're doing compost piles, you don't want your compost mixed in before you want to put it on top.
Right, because the compost is trying to eat the plant.
Okay, so we're not getting rid of our compost, we're just putting it on top.
Right, use it in the right spot, it works. But everybody is trying to grow plants in compost, and that's the problem with our whole industry is that every grower we know is growing their plants in compost. Now, what the main problem we have with that is that it lowers compost in the ground, lowers the oxygen level of the water in the pot. So plants that need more oxygen are in big trouble. So we know that there's a wide tolerance of oxygen levels among plants. The plants on this side can tolerate lower oxygen in the ground. The plants on this side don't do well with that. This is in the textbook. So we know grasses, lilies, conifers, roses, daisies, hibiscus we've known for a while too. Uh, and they, for some reason, they have bird of paradise, which doesn't live up north. So maybe the testing was done in the southern states somewhere. But those are known to be able to handle low oxygen in the soil. The plants on this side all seem to rot real easy. Now, what's interesting is that our industry tells you too much water. There are water plants on this side. So these plants in nature live in a pond, yet they rot real easy in compost. This plant is in compost. There's only a couple leaves left on it because most of the roots on that plant are already rotten. We grew this one in our own soil, which doesn't rot them. But yeah, these are water plants. That was back in the 90s. I was quizzing my supplier. I said, your Alocasia elephant ears are all rotting on us. What's going on? And they couldn't explain anything because it's a water plant, and they were rotting. So we know that compost or dead stuff is really important to the ecosystem of the plant. It's just not where the roots live. Yet our industry hasn't fixed itself. They're growing. Everybody's been told. All the growers who go to college have been told, you got to grow your plants in compost because this has no nutrition, and it doesn't, and it's not supposed to. But it grows great roots. So that's the big dilemma. Now, we know the story of how this happened. First, though, let's talk about what soil is and why it works, why it actually works. So soil, in good soil, is called loam, L-O-A-M. I mean, we see this all the time. We have a lot of horticultural journal articles that are totally wrong. They'll say, you want a rich loam, so you add a lot of compost to the ground. That's not what loam means at all. So loam just means that the soil you have has got the three main components of good soil, which are sand, silt, and clay. That's what loam means. You have significant amounts of sand and clay. Now, you know what sand is. Go to the beach, that's sand. Sand is, if you melt it, you get glass. Most of the sands in the world, there's black sand that's different, but most of the sands in the world are the same material as glass. You melt sand, you get glass. When lightning hits the beach, you get glass. So that's quartz. Quartz, silicon dioxide, quartz, that's what sand is. Silt is a piece of the sand that's smaller. So it's like 1/10 the size of sand. So it's a much smaller piece of sand. Clay are flakes that are mostly silicon dioxide, just like sand and silt, but they're combined with another mineral. Could be aluminum, could be magnesium, I believe, iron, which gives it a little bit of color, and it makes flat flakes out of the silicon dioxide. So that's clay. Now, how does soil form? So the parent material is granite, which is the most common rock on earth, is granite. And the lighter parts of granite are quartz. The darker parts are called feldspar, which becomes, when this breaks down, it becomes the clay. The darker parts, could be red granite. It's got a lot of iron in it. It could be other colors of granite like this. And when you break down on the hills, you'll see decomposed granite, which is the granite broken down just by erosion, by freezing, gravity, all that breaks it down into chunks like this. And then once the river gets done with it, it rounds out all the pieces and they become rounder. So sand and silt are relatively round pieces of quartz. So sand, you could say, is a round piece. Silt is just a lot smaller, rounded piece. And clay are the flakes. And they're really tiny. I mean, clay, individual particles of clay are invisible to us. They're really small, but they are flat. If you see them underneath the microscope, they're flat. So all soils have these. The way soil holds moisture is that soil particles have a negative charge. And water molecules are ionic because water is one oxygen with two smaller hydrogen molecules on one side. And then this is what, positive, and I believe this is negative, something like that. Water is an ionic molecule, so it's attracted to charges. So what water does, it's attracted to the soil particles really hard, one layer thick. So if you look underneath soil, if you dig soil from a few inches below the surface and you look in a microscope, you'll notice that all the particles have this thin layer of water on them. At least one molecule thick, and a lot of times it's wider than that. But clay, being the smallest particle, got huge surface area for its thickness. It still holds water one molecule thick. So clay holds water way much better than sand does, because sand is mostly a big rock with a thin layer of water, whereas clay is a real sliver, flat flake that's still holding one molecule of water. They said clay can sometimes be as thin as 28 molecules thick, whereas sand is like thousands of molecules thick. So clay soils hold water a lot better than sand does. So this is kind of a representation, so you can see, of soil itself. Now, it's off, the scale is off. So the sand, and here is tennis balls, but they should actually be more like bowling ball size. So much larger, because they have to be 10 times bigger than the ping pong balls, which would be the silt. And the clay is real small and it's flat. Probably be better if I put confetti in here, or something about that size, just little flaky things, instead of these lentil seeds, which are fairly flat. So the larger pieces, now sand, if you look underneath a microscope, is relatively round. We're amazed that the rivers do such a good job with sand. So it's relatively round. That's why you walk on the beach, that thing is really moving underneath your feet. Like decomposed granite, it doesn't move much at all because the pieces are pretty square still. It doesn't move as much, but sand, that just moves because the pieces are so round. So if you have a volume filled with round spheres, if these spheres are rock, the solid rock takes up 2/3 of the volume of this container. The spaces between the spheres, 1/3 of the volume. So if you have sandy soil, it's got great airflow. I mean, that air can go through there real easy. So sandy soils can breathe 3 foot deep, 4 foot deep. That air can go through there really easily. Now clay actually has a lot of air spaces too, but they're so tiny. So the size of the air spaces has a lot to do with it. There's too much friction in clay. So even though there's a lot of air spaces around each particle of clay being flat, they're really microscopic air spaces, and the air doesn't flow through there well at all. Plus, it's all filled with water anyway. So the gaps around clay are generally filled more with water than with air. So clay doesn't breathe. So if you have nothing but clay soil, it's holding water quite well. In fact, a foot of sandy soil holds about a 1/2 inch of water or so. So if you have that much water, you pour it into a foot of sand, it'll soak up a foot of sand. Then it'll start going below that. If this was a foot of clay, it may take over an inch or even 2 inches of water to fully soak the clay a foot deep. So clay holds water a lot more efficiently than sand. Roots can grow a lot deeper in sand. So in the long run, it's kind of a trade-off, because in sandy soils, roots might grow 3 foot down, and that 3 foot of sand may hold the same amount of water as 8 inches of clay, because they can only live 8 inches in clay. So it's not a huge difference there, unless your plants are just brand new and starting off. So so it can make a big difference for starting plants. Now, because all this airspace between sand and silt is 33%, if your soil is more than 30% clay, you've filled up all the air spaces. So it's a 35% clay. It can be, 65% sand and silt. But if it's 35% clay, it doesn't breathe, because the clay has filled all those gaps between the particles. So our hills in Orange County back here, they're considered sandy clay. Enough clay to mess up the airflow, but still mostly sand up there and silt. But there's just enough clay to mess up the airflow, so they call it sandy clay.
So if you're going to grow in that, do you dig down and take your top pot and mix it in, or do you stay on top of it?
Well, I mean, most plants will grow in clay. If you have a properly grown plant, if we grew the plant or you bought a bare root plant, you put it in clay, so it's got no problems. There's nothing in there robbing it of oxygen. The problem we have is if you buy a plant that's growing in compost, which is sucking up the oxygen. The other problem with compost is that this compost can provide airflow for a while, because it's not clay, but after it stays moist for a while, this stuff breaks down and starts looking like sludge. No airflow. And actually it's still decomposing until it's gone. I mean, everybody says, well, this is finished compost. It's not finished till it's gone. It's still consuming oxygen until it's totally gone. Well, the problem with that, it becomes negative value to the plant. It's sucking up the oxygen. The clay around it won't let any oxygen in. The plant just starts rotting in the soil. So to keep this plant alive, you've got to do something to your clay to get more oxygen to this plant. If you plant this plant that's growing in compost in sandy soil, the sand can compensate for the decomposing wood and bark that's around this plant. So yeah, if you've got clay soil, adding something more airy to it, and we'll talk about that next week, is one thing you can do. But that's the problem with the industry. Everybody is growing plants in compost because the universities told everyone who went to the universities that you got to grow plants in compost because this has no nutrition. And I've been told that to my face by college professors. You can't grow plants in dirt. So the story is, so my advantage is I'm old enough that my dad grew all his plants in this. I mean, I remember it because I used to play in his dirt pile. This is the texture I'm used to. It's mostly sand, a little bit of silt. Well, mostly sand, quite a bit of silt, very little clay. So sandy loam. Is, say, sand around 60%. Well, actually, that sample there, which is very familiar to me, is about 85% sand. And the silt, the clay in there is only about 8%. So that leaves the silt as being, let's see, that's 93, other 7%. Yeah. And the way you can tell what your soil has in it, you get a clear jar, fill it halfway up with your soil sample. So that's that soil in here. Add water to the neck. This has been evaporating over the years. a few drops of soap so the particles help break up, and shake it for minutes. So all the particles break down into the smaller pieces, and then just set it down. And you have to wait overnight for the clay to settle down. The clay stays in the water overnight. It looks like grease. So on this sample here, the sand comes up to there, and then there's a thin layer of silt, and then a thin layer of clay. I would say the clay is thinner than the silt, so that's hard to tell. But at least we can see how much sand is in there. If you've got that much clay floating on top of the sand, then you've got clay soil. It doesn't take much clay to make clay, so anything higher than 35% is clay. Now a rich loam would have maybe 50% sand, less sand, more clay. So what's interesting is all the old textbooks, especially before 1900, and I have one on my shelf. I haven't found it for a while, but I have a textbook written just before 1900. Some researchers are in California were talking about farming in Orange County, and they said the farmers were all like in Fountain Valley, Costa Mesa, where they had the rich loam clay. So in the old days, they couldn't farm in this stuff because they didn't have the irrigation. This stuff, a couple weeks after the rain stopped, it was bone dry. Couldn't grow a plant in that. So they're over there in Fountain Valley, Costa Mesa with that clay soil, and it would stay wet till summer. They could grow crops in that without irrigation. Of course, in those days, they had the flood irrigation where they flooded the field once a week and then let it dry. But this stuff, you'd have to water it every day, and they couldn't do that until they had stuff like drip irrigation. So the farmer who farms in this, and we lease land for them for 4 years, from 4 years to grow plants on, and they irrigate every day. It's not raining, they're irrigating. So, it doesn't use more water than clay. It's just more frequent. You got to water more frequently on that than you would have to on clay to keep plants happy. So sandy loam breathes better. Clay soil holds water better. Plants do fine in any of those as long as they're not in compost. So, and that's the big problem. So in sandy soil, if you get a plant that's in compost, put in there, it'll do okay. And all these plants tend to not need as much oxygen in their roots anyway, so they do okay. The plants on this side, not so good. So we didn't know this before around 1990. So in the 50s, my dad was growing everything in this. In the early 60s, they started adding things to it to make it lighter. So the problem is that real dirt, fill this bucket up with real dirt, it would be about 100 pounds. You couldn't lift the plants we were selling. In those days, you had 1 gallon plants, you had some 5 gallon plants, and they filled them maybe 2/3 with this, because if they filled to the top, it'd weigh a ton. They didn't have any 15 gallons. They had box trees, because boxes are easier to move. 15 gallons would have been heck to move if they're filled with this. You just couldn't move them. But boxes with the square sides, they're easy to move and take apart when you plant plants. So that's what we had. We had 1 gallon, 5 gallon. They were actually metal containers, actually true cans. They're actually true gallons and true 5 gallons, although we didn't fill them all the way. Then they started making a lot of plastic in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. But the goal in the industry was to get everything lighter. So of course they asked universities. They didn't think they were smart enough, I guess. They asked universities how to make lighter soil, and the universities did a good job. First they said, sand and peat. Peat moss, very light. So that'll get your weight down by a third or so. But peat moss has always been expensive because it's been shipped from Canada, from lakes and bogs in Canada. So they wanted something cheaper. So the university says, well, okay, if you need something cheaper, we'll go 1/3 sand, 1/3 peat, and 1/3 bark. And the plants will do okay in that. But in the 1960s, what I remember is they were, what my father did was he was taking sandy loam and redwood compost. I don't have to sample that here. So redwood compost is redwood shavings. This company uses redwood shavings. So there's shavings of redwood, and redwood just so happens to be the slowest decomposing organic matter known because it's loaded with tannins, these chemicals that help prevent rot. That's why redwood trees can live a long time. And the fallen trees or dead trees decompose so slowly because they're full of tannins. So the redwood stayed fairly intact. So we were doing sandy loam and redwood during the late 60s and mostly through the 70s with excellent results. Because even though I would say now I was still young in those days, I didn't really notice the plants that much, but they did pretty well on that material. Now in the 80s, the virgin redwood forests were all gone. They had taken all the redwood forests down that were not in national parks, and the price of redwood was going up, so they were switching over to fir shavings, which I don't have a sample of, in the 80s, and everything was rotting. We're doing the same mix as the sandy loam and redwood, but with fir doesn't last but half a year. The soil is going like this, the plants are rotting. My dad called up the ag department, they told him, oh, it's your fault, you can't water every day. So my father had watered all his plants in the soil he was using, either this or that with redwood compost. For the previous 30 years he was in business every day without a problem. And suddenly in the 80s, it was a problem. And I was back from college. I decided not to go to medical research and go back and help the business. So he told me, you figure this out. It took me quite a while to figure it out, but we figured out, oh, it's the dead stuff in the soil that's causing trouble. So I met up with a researcher who wasn't associated with the University of California. They were actually sending potting soil up into space shuttles in the 80s and 90s. And he says, yeah, compost is not soil. So we started doing research ourselves. We were using sand as the growing medium just to compare it to what we were doing, and sand was absolutely perfect potting soil. Plants are absolutely gorgeous in sand, but the weight was prohibitive. But this was working a lot better. So in those days, the original potting soils back in the 1800s, they had the original pots in France, greenhouses in France. They had these big clay pots. They were growing citrus in greenhouses in France. And someone in the 1920s analyzed that soil, and they said, yeah, it's 98% sand. And my father's bonsai book, that, in Japan and China, they did bonsai for thousands of years. His textbook said the best potting soil for vigorous growth is sand. But of course, in bonsai, you don't want vigorous plants, you want stunted plants. So they were adding a lot of clay to that sand to keep it from being too vigorous. But all the original textbooks were in agreement that sand or very sandy soil, like the sandy loam, were the best potting soils, but they're heavy. So in the 50s and 60s, you may not remember, but Black Magic came out with peat moss for growing bedding plants and African violets. So peat moss. So peat is a dead plant, but it died a long time ago, thousands of years ago. So there's no disease reaction. It's not like something like you take a tree and cut it down, it just died, and it's capable of rotting. Peat moss has been rotting underwater for hundreds, thousands of years. So there's very little, there's no disease left with peat that's associated with the plants we're growing. It can decompose, but very slowly. So they use that as potting soil for African violets. The problem is you get a big container full of this, it's like a bog, a peat bog, and most plants wouldn't grow in that. So in the 60s and 70s, they started adding chunkier material to it. And I saw the research report, I think it was around 78 or 80, where they found if they added chunks of bark to peat, it would breathe a lot better. The plant they're using for test was seeds, because they didn't think about using this as a permanent medium. They just wanted to start seeds, so something temporary. So bark and peat was a great medium for growing tomato seeds. So they said, oh, that's a good potting soil. So that's when Miracle-Gro and, not Miracle-Gro, that's when Super Soil came out. And they said, oh, great potting soil. The tomato seeds do real well on it. It's a great, but people were using it to grow trees and shrubs in it. We started trying to put citrus in there, and they wouldn't grow at all. They just sit there. We put a fern in there, and they would just rot on us. We're going, well, I don't trust container growing. I don't know what's wrong. So this was in the 80s. I was going, boy, I don't, there's something wrong here. I can't, the potting soils, they say, are really good. We're putting them in big pots and growing plants, and they're not growing. You put them in the ground, and the same plant will grow a foot a year, 2 foot a year, 3 foot a year. You put in a pot, it grows maybe one leaf every year. What's wrong with, there's something wrong here. And at that point, things again are sort of rotting. And the Ag Department says that you can't water it that much. And then finally I met up with this soil guy that was sending soil into the space shuttle. He says, yeah, compost is not dirt. Says he got the idea because he was, NASA researchers make a lot of money. In those days, he says he told me he was getting paid $1,500 an hour in the 80s to study dirt. And he was vacationing in Hawaii, and he noticed it's all volcanic rock here. The plants are doing wonderful in volcanic rock. So we started using pumice rock, which is a lighter version of sand. And so we were trying that too. Said, okay, the plants do wonderful in that, and we got to have to water them twice a day. That's a problem. But boy, do they do well. They do just as well in that as they do in sand, but we have to water more often. So we thought, well, this is 1/3 the way to sand, but it's still not good enough. So I asked the guys at UC Riverside, what holds water the best that's natural? And they said, peat moss. So clay holds water better than peat, but clay doesn't let the water go. It is so hard stuck to clay that even though it stores water well, it won't give it to the plants, whereas peat moss will totally dry out and give the water to the roots. So what we did, we tried the two opposites. This holds, so pumice rock, like this, 70% air. So great airflow, better than sand. Sand is 30% because it's solid. Pumice is 70%, probably because the pieces aren't round, and plus it's got holes through the rock itself. So 70% air, and this has got the best moisture retention. We said, okay, let's get these two opposites, put them together, see what we get. So it was half peat, half pumice. We thought, well, it's got to be acidic if it's half peat. So we created our acid mix back in the early 90s, and everything grew well on it. I mean, anything. Didn't matter if it was acid loving or not. It just grew like a weed. Grew almost as well, I would say as well as it did in sand. We had to fertilize it. We put fertilizer on them, but boy, did we get some fabulous growth either way, this way, that way. We tested this out. We took a little potted plant, put it in our acid mix, set it in a saucer of water. It was a cyclamen, which rot fairly easily, in fact. So we had it in a pot full of this, sitting in water, about a good half inch of water, and it bloomed nonstop, full sun for 7 years. We finally sold it after 7 years. This is a great test. That plant's, in a pot this tall, living in that much water. It usually rots easy, but here it is in this mix, and it keeps on going. So we were very happy with that result. The problem we have is that peat. There's two problems with peat. It's so light, if you water it, you blast a lot of it off the surface of the soil. Plus, peat at 50% volume does compact or break down over time, and you lose volume in this. So we said, okay, we got to make another soil. If we're going to grow a tree or a shrub in a pot, or an indoor plant in a pot, we don't want the soil to be shrinking on us. So let's make something more permanent. So we took some of the peat off and put some sand back in, and some perlite, which is lighter than pumice, back into it. And we got our top pot. And there's no magic with top pot. I mean, there's no compost in it. That's the main thing. So top pot. We created this product about 10 years ago. We've done a lot of different mixes over the years. I mean, this is the second one we did for potting soil. We've had bulk soil mixed up by the old companies, and they don't have sources of a lot of these same materials, so we have them use different blends, but the same thing. There's no ground up wood or bark in it as there is in most potting soils, because we don't want fast decomposition to ever occur on that. So our top pot is actually 35% peat, but the rest of it is inert. So like this is probably 87% organic, either peat or wood products. Ours is 35%, and the rest of it is 30% humus, 20% perlite, 10% sand. Can't put too much sand in because sand is really heavy for its volume, but we still like the different materials. It's all 5% charcoal. So we added charcoal, even though charcoal is super expensive to make. So charcoal is an inert form of wood. And the difference between this and ash is that ash occurs when you burn wood under high oxygen levels, and totally goes to ash, which is a lot of potassium and some other minerals left. Charcoal is this wood that's superheated. It doesn't burn, say, because there's no oxygen, but it changes to a form that's inert. So fungi and bacteria can't eat charcoal, but charcoal absorbs minerals like crazy. So they use charcoal in filters because all the minerals and other things stick to it. So the rich black soils of the world that are rich in black because of a charcoal content. So if you live anywhere near an old volcano, so when you have those volcanic plumes come down the slope, it's a big plume of superheated gases. All the trees in the area just turn to charcoal because it's all carbon dioxide in that plume of volcanic ash and stuff. It's just there's no burning that goes on. It just superheats the trees. They all turn to charcoal on the sides of that mountain. Boy, the side of that mountain is going to be really rich in the future because the charcoal holds on to any mineral nutrients that float on by. So we put charcoal in there. So this is all inert material. And we find that 35% peat, we think the peat moss, even though it does decompose slowly over time, it's not really contributing to the volume anyway, because it's just sitting, the peat is small pieces and they kind of sit between the bigger pieces. So it doesn't, so over time, our soil doesn't seem to shrink in the pot at all. Now, it could be shrinking and the roots of the plants making up some of that volume. But we don't notice much shrinking. I mean, there's initial, when you water our soil, it'll settle, it'll get all the pieces lined up so it settles a little bit. But after a week or so of watering it, it doesn't seem to move anymore. So here's a plant that's been in here almost a year. So this is our soil. And see nice white roots. That's a healthy root system. Whereas, you know, if you take this plant out of this pot, everything's black. Well, the roots, well, it's got some brown roots, it's got some white roots. But the plant's definitely doesn't look healthy. So the most sensitive plants to lack of oxygen that we find, the most sensitive plant we've ever handled, we know rots real easy in compost, is English lavender. I mean, English lavender in our top pot, real easy to grow, because you can let this thing drought for a week. It'll look bad, but it won't die. But if there's a tablespoon of compost in here, you'll rot this thing out. It's really sensitive to lack of oxygen around its roots. We know ceanothus, so we don't sell ceanothus from other growers because it always rots. When we grow it, it doesn't rot. So a lot of the native plants are really prone to rotting, and part of that is because native plants in California haven't been grown in containers for that many years yet, and they haven't selected out the ones that are more sensitive to lack of oxygen. So over time, you know, plants that have been in the trade for 100 years, 150 years, the ones that were sensitive to lack of oxygen soil have been thrown out, and the ones that are more resistant have been selected. But California native plants, they haven't had time, so most of the California, yeah, there's a few, they say, like Concha and Ray Hartman, they can take the compost better, but they still rot out. I mean, I was emailing with a professor at UC Berkeley because he had written a paper. He'd been one of the writers of a paper that was saying that all the revegetation projects along California highways of native plants failing. And their conclusion was the plants that they were getting from the growers already had root rot when they got them. And so I emailed this guy and I said, well, it's got to be the recycled dead stuff in there. He says, I concur. They shouldn't be growing plants in dead plants. But that wasn't part of the research project. They were just, you know, all the research they were just pointing out was that at this point it was not useful to revegetate with the California natives because they all failed. It's just terrible. None of our growers seem to understand. Now, I will tell you, there is a grower in Northern California. It's Las Politas growers. And on their website, they say, why aren't plants being grown in real dirt? So they're questioning the industry too. And that's the only other nursery I know that has questioned the use of organics in growing medium for plants. Everyone else follows the universities like they're gods. And that is a problem in our industry because the gods don't believe they can't recant their research. So the reason why they say that to grow, because they weren't asked the right question. So the problem is that the growers, the colleges weren't asked the right question. They're asked, how do you grow a plant in a container the quickest? Not the best in the long run. That wasn't the question. how do you get this plant ready for sale the quickest? And they found out that bark holds enough water, but it's so airy that for the 3 months it takes the grower to get a plant ready to sell, it'll grow faster in here. But the same research shows that in 8 months this becomes the toxic medium. It starts killing the plant off because it's broken down, it's no longer permeable, and it's creating sewer gases. So the research paper told the nurseries, you use this, you got to make sure your plants are sold within 5 months. Or else you have choices. You can surround them with more airy bark, fresh bark. You throw it away. Of course, the third option, you sell it before it dies. So that's what's happening in our industry, is that the nurseries sell the plants they're growing in bark before they die. Now again, some plants like these will tolerate it. So you see plants that succeed in people's yards, it's usually on this side of the table. Plants on this side, and I forgot to put gardenias over here, they usually fail. Even if they're in sand, these often fail because they're so sensitive to the lack of oxygen in the soil. So here we've got cordylines, dianella, ceanothus, gardenia should be here, azaleas, ferns should be on this side, flax plants. On this side, grasses, roses, daisies, lilies. Now, we carry a lot of plants from other growers still, even though they're not growing in the right soil, usually on this side of the table, because no one kills these plants in compost. But you can see, here's a plant that shows the difference. This is hibiscus grown in our soil, and this is hibiscus grown in compost. They both spent the winter here. This one was still younger, but it was outside all winter in our soil. This one was outside in their soil winter, and it dropped all its leaves. It went totally bare, and now it's growing back because the soil can breathe again. But you can see the color of the foliage. Now, they're not the same hibiscus, but still, the color in compost is not as good as it could be. If this was in our soil, it'd be much greener. And the really weird thing is, over the years, we've taken plants out of compost and put them into our soil. Thousands of plants over there. We do plants every week. And the color change back to this color happens often overnight. It's just crazy. It looks like these plants are holding their breath. And you get them out of that soil and get them into our soil, and then suddenly they're a lot greener. The other thing so what was really interesting was back when the soil scientist and I were first talking, he wanted me to discover this on my own. So he says, what's your most difficult plant that rots? Well, it was papayas. If you watered papaya plants in super soil 2 days in a row, you could be certain that plant would turn yellow, rot, and fall out of the pot. It was that sensitive to the soil staying wet. So he said, okay, bring that and bring it, and I'll show you what happens. So I took the papaya, and he handed me an ice pick. He says, okay, here, take your time, start taking the soil off the roots of this plant carefully, and watch the plant. So my papaya was like this, and I was taking the soil off, and about a half hour later, I had suddenly noticed, after picking out the soil for a half hour, I noticed the plant went from here, the leaves did this. All the leaves stuck up. The plant looked so much happier just getting that compost off its root system. I was just amazed. I'm going, well, God, this is crazy. Why are we using that soil? So that's the moment where we decided we couldn't sell the commercial potting soils anymore. They were like poison. They were, negative value to the plant. Sand was great. So that's when we made both of our potting soils. That's what it started to make potting soils, because the potting soils we were selling. Now, this brand of potting soil is good for at least 3 months. So we were at a UCLA seminar sponsored by UCLA on potting soil. This was back in the 90s, I believe it was. And they told us that, yes, the goal of commercial potting soil is not to make anything permanent, because most of the people who grow plants in pots um, in the United States, they plant their plants in April or spring of every year, and by Thanksgiving, they're frozen dead. So all we need is a potting soil to last 5 months. So, so most potting soil in the United States are meant to last 5 months. And we're going, okay, that's not what we want in California. We want a potting soil that lasts as long as the plant will stay alive, not 5 months. So that's the state of our industry. I mean, when we made our own potting soil, the the EPA of California quizzed us. They said, "How can you call this potting soil? Where's the compost?" Because they were taught at the EPA that if there's no compost, it can't be potting soil. That's how bad the industry is. The whole industry. It's, they think that compost. Now again, we say compost is part of the ecosystem. You put it on top of the pots. The dead leaves go on top of the soil. Plant's fine. No compost in the soil. So that's the problems we're having. So next week we'll be talking a lot about how to deal with plants that are in the wrong soil, and install them in the ground and or fix them. You can, the plants, we've learned over the years what's fixable, what's not, what needs to be fixed, which you shouldn't touch. So we'll talk about that next week. Now, what's also interesting is the farming industry knows all this because they get their information from the agriculture department. The horticulture industry thinks that compost is the best soil, but the ag industry found out years ago, decades ago, that none of this stuff works. There's no farm that grows stuff in compost. You go to the hothouses of the world, hothouses are real expensive to run, so they, it's got to be a real expensive product to grow in a hothouse, so they use the best soils. We've looked at the research in Holland. Holland probably has the most hothouses per capita of any place in the world, so they did their own research, and they use stuff like sand, pumice, vermiculite, perlite. Clay pellets are interesting. So clay fired into pellets, so there's airspace between them. This is the most expensive soil, and it's used for the most expensive crops. So if you see a proper marijuana grower, they grow them in clay pellets because this works. It holds water, it breathes well, it does everything that the farmer wants. Real expensive, but they get a lot of money for growing marijuana. So the Holland industry in Europe, they invented wood pallets. The way of product transport using wood pallets and forklifts, that was developed in Europe. So they had a lot of old wood to get rid of. So they said they did all this research on grinding up wood and grinding up bark to make soils for their farms. They said it doesn't work. So on this side, they do use peat moss, coconut coir, and rice hulls as growing mediums also. So they know that peat moss can stay airy enough for a short crop, maybe 8 months, maybe a year, and this before it loses all its permeability and the roots start rotting. Coconut coir is about the same. We get about 8 months, 12 months of good use out of it. Rice hulls don't decompose at all. They're like 90% silica, so they're almost the same as sand. So these materials, they said, you can use as a growing medium in a hothouse too. They know exactly how long these will last. They know how long this is last. I mean, these last forever. But with wood, they said you ground up a piece of wood. They said different parts of wood decompose at different rates. They can't predict how long that piece, that ground up wood will last to grow a plant in before it fails. Bark, same thing. They cannot predict. Bark's not uniform enough to predict how fast it will decompose. So in Europe, at least in hothouses, they stay away from bark and wood. But in the U.S., what the plants are being grown in, bark and wood. And we've had nurseries actually tell us, sales rep actually tell us, they got a bad batch of bark and it killed all their camellias. It's like, it's like, okay, you asked for it. But again, it's not their fault. They were taught that by the colleges to use bark as a growing medium. And it's like, and one of these days, someone will look up and find out that none of this stuff works at all, or it's not good. It's been so long now, 80 since they've been using bark as a growing, as they started promoting bark as a growing medium, and we saw it in the early 90s, the difference. And to us, it's like that fairy tale, Emperor's New Clothes. It's like you got to be totally blind not to see that ground up bark and wood are totally of negative value to a plant, and that mineral things like these, or at least long lasting things like this, are what plants should be grown in. But our industry is for some reason listening to PhDs, and a lot of PhDs out there. And I can't say too much bad things about them. I have 2 PhD brothers. It's like, they live in a different world. So I don't have a PhD, but that was my goal in life, was to get one. But anyway, we learned by testing, which is what a PhD is supposed to do, and this is the better way to go. So now the most important thing I'll mention to new gardeners is that don't mess up your yard before you start. So don't listen to contractors that come in and want to add compost to your entire yard, because that'll make it unlivable for many plants. I mean, again, a tomato will grow in it. The plants that, tomatoes should be on this side. They can tolerate growing in pure compost. Probably the only plant that can. If you have a compost pile, tomatoes will grow out of that thing. Nothing else can ever do that, because the compost is eating up their roots. But tomatoes were bred to live among the dead, so they can handle that. In fact, we found out that a lot of potting soils, that's how they test it. It grows a good tomato plant. It's really good soil. Again, tomatoes are the lowest place to reach for getting good soil. Is the bottom of the rung is tomatoes. So do not add compost to your garden. Do not buy something that's got organic matter in it. So there's a lot of bulk soils being sold that are called topsoil. Not all topsoils have, because true topsoil would look like this. Blue Ribbon Building Supplies up in Orange has proper topsoil, but most places that sell topsoil will mix this and this, because they don't think this is good soil. They think you've got to add compost to it. In fact, a lot of places tell you, you want enough compost to your soil to make it rich and black. Well, unfortunately, when you make it rich and black from compost, it's because you're creating black sewer gases, which are totally toxic. So you've just killed off your entire garden if it becomes rich and black, or at least you killed it off to all these plants. These plants think it's a wasteland now, and you'll have to grow plants on this side. So that's our main message. Any questions today? Okay. Thank you.